Good afternoon, everyone. This is a concurrent session meeting on Korea's nation branding and international cooperation. So please check if you are in the right meeting. Well, my name is Oh Jun. I'm Deputy Foreign Minister in charge of multilateral and global affairs. I'm supposed to moderate this session. I'm honored to do that. Let me start by introducing the panelists and discussants who will speak today. And in accordance with the rules applied to other meetings, we will give 10 minutes to paper presenters and 5 minutes to discussants. Let me start with Mr. Simon Anholt sitting on my left. As you know, you already heard him at the previous meeting, and he's currently a member of the British government's Public Diplomacy Board, and he's well known for having launched the Anholt Nation Brand Index, and he's editing them annually, I think, which provides rankings by brand value of cities and countries. Sitting on his left is Professor Nicholas Kerr, who is a professor of public diplomacy at the University of Southern California, and he holds a PhD from the University of Leeds, and he has been teaching at schools at universities like University of Birmingham and Leicester. Leicester, right?
Usually no one can pronounce that, so you're very good.
I spent some time in London. On his left is a discussant today, Professor Sonyar. He's a professor of Japanese studies at Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago on political science, and he has written many articles and books about, not least about Japanese industrial governance. On my right is Ambassador Chang Shijung. He's ambassador designate to Qatar, but he is currently, he's still working as vice president of KOICA, which is the acronym of Korea International Cooperation Agency. And he is a graduate of Seoul National University, and he studied at Freiburg University in Germany. And he has served in countries like Germany, Indonesia, and Canada. On his right is Professor Choi Jung-hwa. Here it is. She is a professor at the Graduate School of Interpretation and Translation at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. She holds a PhD from École supérieure d'interprètes et de traducteurs at Paris University. And she has been active and well known as a pioneer in the studies of interpretation and translation. On her right is Director General Lee Yoon, who is my colleague, and he is the Director General for Policy Planning at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's a graduate of Seoul National University, and he holds a master's degree from Columbia University in New York. He has served in countries like the Netherlands, Japan, the Philippines, and New York. So having introduced all the panelists, I would like to start with an exchange I had with some other participants yesterday. at the lunch we had here yesterday, a gentleman sitting next to me was flipping through the conference program and checking out the meetings, I guess. And he asked, what is nation branding? I was not sure whether he was asking me or asking to himself, but anyway, I responded, and I said, well, I guess it's probably a similar concept as public relations efforts undertaken by companies. So in other words, I think we Koreans, we would like to project better images of Korea, more correct understanding of Korea all over the world. And then another gentleman who was ambassador from an Asian country sitting next to me asked me, why do you want to do that? You know, we all know about Korea, so why do you want to promote Korea's name abroad? We already have very good name of Korea in our country. And I said, I guess probably because we sometimes, even though Korea is known in foreign countries, sometimes well known in some Asian countries, I think sometimes we find misunderstandings, sometimes distorted understanding, sometimes not so good images of Korea. So we want to improve them. Well, I'm no expert on this issue, so that was the best answer I could give them. But all these panelists today, I think, will give us better answers than I gave them. And I will start, without further ado, I will start with Mr. Simon Anhalt, please.
Thank you very much, Minister. Right, 10 minutes. I think I should be able to just cover three of the 11,422 subtopics that there are in this field. The first one is about integrity, and I have shamelessly taken my lead from Professor Kull's very important words at the end of the last session. For heaven's sake, let us please do these things for the right reasons. This is something that both of us, in our different ways and in our different fields, have been saying for a great many years. If you do the right things for the wrong reasons, people are not stupid and they will realize it. Something that I've been saying to governments for many years is that the moment you have decided that you're interested in your nation's image, you should then forget about it. And you should stop thinking about image, and you should stop thinking about reputation, because it contaminates your thinking and it contaminates your planning, and it makes you do things for the wrong reason. And if you do things for the wrong reason, people will find you out very, very quickly indeed. So that's a question of integrity. Integrity is a word which is often used in this and in many other fields. Just have a think about the origin of that word, integrity. It comes from the Latin word which means whole, W-H-O-L-E. Integrity, in other words, is about being one thing, about learning how to be yourself. This is extraordinarily difficult for a country, especially for a large, modern, wealthy, thriving, prosperous country. This is one of the reasons why I dislike the term nation branding. There are so many more differences than there are similarities between products and countries. But perhaps the most obvious difference is that products benefit from being simple. And it's possible to brand a product because it's just one thing. And it does one thing. And it has a USP, a unique selling proposition. And that's really rather easy to sell. So if you're selling washing powder to wash your clothes, Persil is the brand which comes to my mind. Persil washes whiter. Can you say one thing about Korea that's really true? Of course you can't. It's a country. Now, when you're trying to sell a corporation, that's a little bit different, because you're there under a contract of employment, which is a very different thing from a social contract. People are there because they're employed by you. And it's no accident that the countries which have been most successful in branding themselves are the ones which are run most like corporations. Dubai, Singapore, North Korea. These countries have been enormously successful at creating a single, simple-minded, powerful, occasionally negative, but undisputably very powerful image of themselves, because they're run by like corporations. A corporation is not a democracy. A corporation is a kind of tolerated tyranny, where you have a man, usually, in charge, who is the chief executive officer. And he is a mad bastard who stands up on the table and says, this is my brand, this is my vision, and if you don't like it, you're fired. Governments of democratic countries don't do that and shouldn't do that. So in a sense, nation branding is the problem. It's not the solution. We can't brand Korea. We can't brand any country if a brand is a childish simplification of the complexity of a country. It's public opinion that brands countries. It's public opinion that turns France into purely a lifestyle product, or Italy purely into a sexy country where they know about fashion, or Switzerland purely into the country where they make clocks and chocolate. This is branding, and it's a bad thing, because it takes the richness and the complexity and the diversity of a rich, complex, diverse country, and it turns it into a silly, childish narrative. So in a sense, what we should be talking about here is not nation branding, but exactly the opposite. Trying to create knowledge, understanding, awareness of the rich, contradictory nature of this country, so that people know everything about it, the pros and the cons, the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the right and the left, not to try to turn it into some kind of product on the shelf of a supermarket. Nation branding, for this reason, is a very dangerous concept, because it runs the risk of trivializing something very important, which a lot of people have spent a great many years fighting for. That was my first rant. So the second thing is a very tiny point, but it's one I want to underline because it's important. A lot of the discussion in the previous session confused two very important audiences. When you're talking about the way a country is perceived in other countries, you must always distinguish between mass audiences and elite audiences. They are quite different and they behave in quite different ways. People like us who go to conferences like this normally only relate to elite audiences. We spend our time reading fancy newspapers. We read The Economist, we read the Wall Street Journal. We meet ambassadors and journalists and investment brokers and diplomats. And we end up getting the impression that everybody in the world is very well informed about our country. Now, if you talk to the elite audience about Korea, you will get a very flattering impression of the image of your country, because it's the job of elites to know the facts. It's the job of elites not to be swayed by the brand image. It's the job of elites to know the very latest information about a country and to understand something of its future prospects. This is a very different creature from the mass audience. The mass audience, the people who will one day buy Korean products or come to Korea on holiday, they're very different. They are, I'm sorry to say, ignorant. I've often said that my Nation Brands Index is nothing more than an index of ignorance. It tells us not how much people know about countries like Korea, but how little they know, and how little they know about any country, including their own. People know virtually nothing about other countries, and one has to accept that, and one has to take it on board, because that's what one is dealing with. So remember, the elite audience is like the judge. The mass audience is like the jury. You have to know how to deal with both of them and on their own terms, because they're very different. Finally, and very quickly, because I've left myself 2 minutes, I realize that I spent most of my brief talk in the earlier session saying how impossible it is to change the image of a nation. Now, I often do that, and then people say to me, so what's your job? Well, my job, apart from trying to discourage people from doing nation branding, is to try to give some sort of useful clues to governments about how they can improve the image of their country. In reality, there's very little they can do. But they can, in some ways, shorten the gap between an improved reality and an improved perception of that reality. Because if you are a good country and you're doing good things, sooner or later people will know about it. But it's much more likely to be later than sooner. I spoke this morning of how Ireland's image had improved during the last few years. Well, I was really talking about improved amongst the elite audiences. If you talk to mass audiences, even in Western Europe, you will find that they still have a picture of Ireland which dates from about 1955. If you ask people's impressions of Scotland, another country I've surveyed recently, in Western Europe, they will describe Scotland using the same terms that were used by a novelist called Sir Walter Scott 150 years ago. Now, these young people in Europe, have never heard of Sir Walter Scott, but the image of Scotland that they have received is 150 years old. So the images of countries are a little bit like starlight. If you go outside and you look at the sky and you say, oh, look at those beautiful stars, and you've made the mistake of going outside with an astronomer, the astronomer will say, look at what were beautiful stars. Because, of course, the stars you're looking at today died hundreds of millions of years ago, and the light has only just reached us now. Countries are like that. So next time you feel impatient about how slow the world is at recognizing Korea's achievements, remember the starlight effect. Normally, it takes about 100 years before an indifferent public in another part of the world notices what you're doing, because, as I said before, you are of no relevance to them. So what can you do? Well, you can do, I think, 3 things. First of all, you need to have a strategy. What is a strategy? It's a shared vision of where the country is going, what the country is for. What is South Korea for? I think in the globalized world, this is a tremendously difficult and tremendously important question to answer. What are you for? À quoi sert Korea? If God accidentally slipped on his celestial keyboard tomorrow and hit the delete key and deleted South Korea, would anybody mind? And who would mind? And why would they mind? What is Korea for? The second question is to ask, what is the genius of the Koreans? I don't mean a specific industrial sector, because that might change in 10 years' time. And remember, we're talking in a 100-year timescale here. But what is the genius of the Korean people that makes them good at whatever it is they do? That's a question you need to be able to answer. And you need to look at your image today and measure it objectively, without flattering yourselves, objectively. What do ordinary people in other countries actually think about Korea today? And then have a vision of how you believe you deserve to be viewed by those people at some point in the future. In 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years' time, it doesn't matter. What reputation do you believe you deserve or could one day deserve? And then the strategy is quite simply, what do we need to do in order to earn that reputation? That's strategy. Number 2, substance. You have to do the physical things that earn you that reputation. You have to build the cities. You have to have the events. You have to give the foreign aid. The environment wasn't mentioned this morning, but it's incredibly important. One of the things my study shows me is that today, most people find it impossible to respect a country that does not proactively work towards the environment. Korea has been making good, visible public steps in this direction. I'm surprised it wasn't mentioned. That's just as important as giving aid to poor countries. And it's a way of showing that you matter, and it's a way of showing that you count. That's the substance, and there needs to be a plan for that. And then finally, the mysterious X factor, which is what I call symbolic actions. If you have the plan and you do the good things, Korea will become, gradually, a better and better country. And the world will realize that in 125 years. If you want that to happen in 25 years instead of 125, you have to make sure that the substance that you carry out as a country is particularly communicative substance. Media-friendly, if you want to use a trivial term for it. That the things you do, the actions you perform, every now and again, they are striking, memorable, distinctive, unmistakable, shocking, remarkable, romantic, fascinating, unforgettable, etc., etc. The trouble with politicians is that they're boring. Politicians need to be boring because they're dealing with very important things, and because people don't vote for them unless they're boring. But doing this kind of strategy, unfortunately, requires people to be the opposite of boring. They have to understand what moves ordinary people. You would think politicians would be good at that, but they're not. They have to understand what inspires people, what attracts their attention. And that's why the public-private consortium is so very important. The private sector is very good at understanding what makes people tick, particularly in other countries. The politicians, if they're good, are very good at creating the initiatives, the investments, and the substance which will make that happen. So I'll shut up now because I've overrun my time, but remember, please, those 3 things. Number 1, integrity. Forget branding, forget image. Do what you want to do because it's right for you, and the image will follow quite naturally without you having to worry about it. Secondly, remember the difference between elite audiences and mass audiences. You need to be communicating with both of them in different ways. Thirdly, remember the only way to shorten the gap between an improved reality and an improved perception is through having a strategy shared across all sectors and civil society, good substance, carried out over many years to international standards, and occasional or frequent symbolic actions that will bring it home to publics around the world. Building a reputation is like trying to fill up a bathtub when somebody has stolen the plug. As soon as you pour some water into the bathtub, it runs away. Building a reputation is not a sprint, it's a relay race. You have to be obsessive about asking yourselves, what do we do next? What do we do next? What do we do next? Because nobody is listening and nobody cares. I'll shut up now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Anhorth, for that enlightening philosophical presentation. But somehow I get the feeling that our task is getting more and more difficult. Now, let me turn to Ambassador Chang, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by warmly thanking the organizers for inviting me today to talk about Korea's national brand in relation to its international development cooperation. 2 years ago, I myself organized the Jeju Peace Forum as a member of the Secretariat. This meeting is therefore very special to me. If I'm to talk about today's theme, I can summarize with 3 keywords, namely Korea, development cooperation, and brand. Separately, these words have no value with regard to what I want to say today. However, when we put them all together, I think they have great value. Before I proceed, I would like to tell you some short personal stories about the perception of Korea and the Korean brand from my time as Vice President of KOICA. In short, I discovered that Korea had a far better reputation than I had expected, at least in our partner countries in the field of development cooperation. For example, I happened to be in Kenya in last July at the same time that President Obama was in Ghana. During Mr. Obama's visit in Ghana, he made a comparison between Kenya, the homeland of his father, and Korea. He noted how in the year that he was born, I think 1959, Kenya's GDP per capita was actually larger than Korea's, but now Kenya had been badly outpaced by Korea. The Kenyan Vice Minister of Finance complained to me about this unfavorable comparison, but at the same time, he noted his envy of Korea's advancement and further how he wanted Korea to share its experience as much as possible. Similarly, last July in Tunisia, the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs surprised me by stating that the simple presence of Korean overseas volunteers was conveying the successful development experience of Korea to local people, and that it had been an inspiration to those who lived near them and requested that more volunteers be dispatched. Earlier this year in Guatemala, at the opening of an IT vocational training center funded by KOICA, the Vice President stressed to me the importance of human resources development in Guatemala and that they could learn a lot from Korea's experience. His perception of Korea was very positive due to Korea's very successful experience in education. Finally, in Uzbekistan in April of last year, another official remarked that Uzbek people like the Korean drama Daejangum so much that when it was on television, it was impossible to see any people in the streets. These experiences have demonstrated that Korea's reputation in our partner countries was often very positive. Of course, I think working for an aid organization and spending most of my time with people who are looking to receive aid, there is always the chance that the compliments I have received about Korea are not real, but are in fact no more than a gracious host who wishes to smooth the path to gaining aid. However, definitely, I can all spot a true heartfelt compliment from a false one simply by its content and the reasoning behind it. Once again, however, for these and all other developing countries, the task of development is very crucial and is a much more important and substantial issue than a certain country's image or brand. In fact, originally, development, cooperation, and branding are by their very nature not considered comparable or relevant to each other, in that development is much more concerned with the state of the human race. But in spite of this, I think a lack of participation in the global development agenda by any leading economy will in itself create a negative brand for the country or result in a fatal destruction of the nation's reputation. Moving from my personal experiences to a wider perspective on how development cooperation can influence Korea's national brand, I will summarize with 6 key agendas which we need to focus on, such as aid volume or innovative schemes or sharing Korea's experiences and so on. Well, number one agenda is about aid volume. Korea's aid volume is generally regarded as insufficient compared to countries' economic size. Indeed, increasing ODA volume is very essential for Korea to become a responsible member of the international community. However, the fact that Korea's ODA volume has increased at a very rapid pace during the past 20 years should not be overlooked either. For example, ODA volume in 2000 was $200 million and has since quadrupled to $800 million last year. This is definitely an outstanding achievement in terms of ODA policy. Korea further also plans to scale up its ODA volume to 0.25% of GNI by 2015. The long-term plan to increase ODA has been emphasized by the Lee Myung-bak government and was reconfirmed at the Korea-ASEAN Summit meeting in June here in Jeju, and at the President's Summit meeting with President Obama in July. Prime Minister Han Sung-soo also declared at a UN MDG meeting last year that Korean governments will increase ODA GNI ratio to 0.25% by 2015, with $200 million for the East Asia Climate Partnership and $100 million to assist with the worldwide food crisis. The National Assembly's interest and support is also very strong, as demonstrated by the submission of 5 new ODA bills. Consequently, the political will for increasing ODA within the Korean government is obvious. Besides political will, establishing an explicit roadmap and making it public widely also very important. However, public awareness and support at the moment is not sufficient, I think. Therefore, it is important to raise public awareness about ODA through various efforts such as public awareness programs with universities and NGOs by KOICA. Public support and consensus are prerequisite for scaling up ODA volume. The Swedish case provides a good example. In 2007, in Sweden, there was a historical regime change from a social party to conservative party. The new conservative party, ruling party, has kept their ODA ratio at 1% despite a big economic downturn. I think it was mainly due to the Swedish people's strong national consensus and public support for ODA. One thing here I'd like to remind, I think the political leadership should pay attention to aid system. The Korean government's will to increase ODA volume is satisfactory, but the will to streamline the fragmented aid architecture is very disappointing. This issue was pointed out by the OECD DAC special review last year, but it is not easy to solve due to the current position of both ministries responsible for ODA, which are the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Finance. I think only top government leadership can create a breakthrough in this matter, as we have seen in the case of JICA. Well, number 2 item is innovative schemes, and number 3 agenda is about sharing Korea's experience in socio-economic development, and number 5, the whole of government approach. Well, about these items, please refer to a handbook. And lastly, I would like to talk about a very important item. It is a long-term vision. I would like to address the fact that Korea should set up ODA policy with a long-term vision and a focus on more humanitarian factors. Some countries explicitly use aid as a means to enhance economic cooperation and strengthen their geopolitical position.